is there an element to changing consumer behavior? So almost psychologically, we need to be doing in order to create more willingness to adopt, not single-use plastic products. It's more of a philosophical question now. Welcome back. Another episode of Demystifying Cosmetics. We have an exciting episode with guest Insiya Jafferjee, who is the founder and CEO of Shellworks, which is a startup on a mission to eliminate plastic pollution. She's originally from Sri Lanka and holds a Bachelor of Science in Product Design from Stanford University and a Master of Arts and a Master in Science from Royal College of Art and Imperial College. She's always been fascinated with working at the intersection of cutting-edge research, design, and engineering, and has spent her time at corporations like Bose, Ford Motor Company, and Apple, after which she moved to London to start Shellworks. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to be discussing sustainable packaging as it applies to the cosmetic industry, as well as some innovation specifically to what Shellworks does. But to start, what to you does sustainable packaging mean in the context of cosmetics?
It's such a great question because it is, to kick us off, because I actually think it's such a complicated answer. And I think that complexity is why it's difficult in this particular industry to make decisions around packaging. So sustainable packaging can mean so many different things in cosmetics. It can mean, have you looked at the LCA of your packaging, so where you're purchasing it from? Some people will talk about, we made our packaging in the US because we're a US-based company, for example.
And just for anyone listening, LCA, we're talking about life cycle assessment.
Yes, thanks for catching that.
Great.
The second could be, how have you designed your product itself? So have you removed weight that could have otherwise been unnecessary? The third is, have you considered the end of life? And I think this is the one that really most people focus on, is like, how do you dispose of it? Have you designed it to actually be recyclable? And what is the difference between technically recyclable to what will actually be recycled? Or have you kind of innovated with new materials so that end of life can be simpler? But I think it is all of these different things when people think about, what is sustainable packaging within the cosmetics industry.
And in terms of the technically recyclable versus, let's say, I guess on the other end of the spectrum, is that curbside recycling? What are those kind of nuances in terms of recycling?
Yeah. So often something that could be recycled, or what we as consumers, actually a friend of mine introduced me to this term, wish cycling, that we wish is recycled is actually not able to be recycled. And I love that phrase because I think it's so true. As a consumer, you're doing so much work, like washing these things, separating these things in the hope that it is recycled. But often a lot of the way that cosmetic packagings are designed fundamentally make them unrecyclable. And what I mean by that is that they are multi-material. And actually, just taking a step back, the cosmetics industry, it's honestly defined by aesthetics. We care so much about what these things look and feel like because it helps us stand out on the shelf. There's so many brands competing in this space, so it's really important. But what that means is you end up bringing a lot of different materials into the same component. So if you think about like your jar, it's made from glass. Most likely it has a tinted glass. Maybe it's colored or frosted or green or black. It's got some printing on it. It's also got a cap, which is often plastic. And then inside the cap, there's a liner, which is an EPE foam. So you can already kind of see it's made from multiple materials, which inherently makes it really complex to throw away. The second, and this kind of shocks a lot of people when we share this, is items that are smaller than 2 inches by 2 inches in any direction won't typically be recycled because it'll fall through the grates. And these grates are kind of used across different recycling centers. So cosmetics, again, an industry that relies a lot on sampling, which are all these really small items, really finds it hard to provide packaging that will actually end up in the right place because it'll fundamentally fall through these cracks. So a few things in technically recyclable versus what is actually curbside recycled.
And in terms of the materials that are commonly used in sustainable package, what are they and how do they compare to traditional materials? I've always thought of plastic as unfortunately being a workhorse.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. In this industry, plastic is that workhorse because you can get so much out of it, right? Like you can get different colors, different aesthetics, different feels. Typically, what we've seen in the industry, glass is considered a sustainable material. Moving to aluminum has been considered a sustainable material. Some aspects of PCR itself, so incorporating recycled materials. And then
consumer resin, yep.
Yeah, post-consumer resin.
The acronym kerfuffle here.
I always say I hate acronyms for this very reason. But yeah, post-consumer recycled plastics. And then there is, it's a much smaller portion of customers, but there are a portion of customers who are, testing out new materials that may not have the same burden as the end of life. So if you think of a small item, using a new material for that could be degrade in landfill, that could compost. Those are some of the options that now customers are starting to explore as well.
And in terms of Shellworks, what is this alternative material that you guys are using?
Yeah, so we are in that space of a different kind of material. And it's for that very reason, is that right now our waste infrastructure doesn't have the capability to tackle everything. So we wanted to be able to create a seamless experience for a consumer and also allow brands to take some of that responsibility. We kind of create a material that'll decompose in any natural environment. And what we kind of mean by that is that really, if you throw it in your general waste bin, it'll degrade in a landfill. If you have a home compost, even better, because then you get to see how that material will degrade. But it is very similar to other natural materials that we use in our world, like something like cellulose, right? We engage with it, paper, all the time, but we know that it won't necessarily hurt the environment or pollute the environment because it is coming from a natural source. So you can go back to those natural origins. And our particular material is one that is fabricated through collaboration with microorganisms. So things like bacteria, these really small organisms in our world, they have a capability to build up materials in their cells, actually polymers, entire polymers that behave like plastics in their use. But the beauty of it is that, again, because they're created by a natural world, they're able to be digested by a natural world. So those same microorganisms will recognize it as food and break it down.
And then in terms of, I think, the top question that comes to mind when you say, well, it will naturally break down in a compost is, how does it then perform when in contact with an aqueous formulation?
This is one of the benefits of technology, and the fact that it is made by microorganisms is that it can only degrade when it comes into contact with a large amount of organic matter. So it really does have to end up either deep into like a home compost environment, a soil environment, and really covered for it to break down, which is different to traditional biodegradable materials where they are broken down through high heat and high water, which is why for the cosmetics industry, they've always proven to be trickier because of, the cosmetics industry has innovated on formulation and they love the flexibility of that innovation. But what that means is it's multiple different ingredients coming together, which can, pose a lot of problems for materials that are broken down by heat and water.
And do consumers, so if you have a bottle that's made with the material that Shellworks produces, and what is the name of the material? I know it has a trade name. Is it?
It's Vivama. So the material we make is
Vivama. Okay.
Yeah.
Are the bottles that you have, is there a way for you to reuse them, for brands to reuse them? If they go to a recycling facility, are they automatically rejected and then go to a landfill where then they meet their end fate and able to break down? Kind of how has this new material, how has it fit into, I guess, existing infrastructure?
Yeah, of course. So best case scenario, you get to compost it yourself. If not, you put it in your trash. And like you said, it could either end up in recycling, it could either end up in your general waste. If it ends up in a general waste, most likely it's going to landfill where it'll break down. If it ends up in a recycling center, actually, yeah, we have done some testing that demonstrates that it will be sorted out, just like another material. And then again, that ends up going back to landfill most likely where it'll break down.
Okay. And in terms of these innovations, how have you seen them starting to change the landscape of the personal care and cosmetic industry?
So this is an industry where innovation is hand in hand with sustainability. Like, I think if you go to any big cosmetic packaging fair, whether it's like Cosmopack or Luxpack, you'll start to see they are hand in hand. So everything talks about reducing weight, refillable solutions, new material solutions, and it is an indication of like where the industry is going. At the moment, it still is, and I think this is where like we could do more work, is defining what good looks like and what we're comparing to. My sustainability lead at Shellworks always says this really well. She's like, sustainability is really hard to define, but what you need to do is compare what your previous process is with what your new process is, and making sure that we're always making incremental change. And I think that's where it's still not clear for a brand when they're making that decision. How do I do that comparison? Like, how do I make that choice? And I think that's why it feels quite complex and hard.
Excellent segue into challenges and barriers. So when you talk to brands, what are you hearing are some of the difficulties in transitioning to more sustainable packaging and making that progress forward?
I think candidly, for me, it's just twofold. The first is, how can I communicate this simply to my consumer? You just asked me a lot of questions around like our packaging and how do you dispose of it. It's a lot of information to give to a consumer. And you want it to be simple, right? You want it to be simple. And similar to what I said, like recyclable does seem simple, except when you dive into it, then you learn about all these complexities. But with something new, you often think of the complexities first. So I think there is the challenge of how do you simply describe something to a consumer. And then I think the second is, how can you make a credible claim? In this space, there's been so much greenwashing. And I think the two are really well linked to each other, because in trying to make a credible claim, then you end up giving information, a lot of information that is hard to understand because you want it to be a razor-tight claim.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that we've always been debating here at Shellworks, is like, how do you, it's not even a material challenge. It's not even a product challenge. It's more of a philosophical challenge of like, how do you communicate something that's new, that is meant to solve the problem, but doesn't exist within the frameworks that we all know in our day-to-day life. I think that doesn't just exist for packaging. I think that is true with like innovation, even with things like ingredients, something that's on the cutting edge. Like, how do you simplify something that is new?
Yeah, I think there was, we had a marketing research group come in and they kind of explained it as, you need to be able to catch someone's attention and hold it within a 10-second time frame. And so how do you relay information about something new, exciting, maintain it, but then not, kind of spend too much time getting to a point. And it is, I think, a fine line that you have to walk with a lot of different things. And for supply chain, cost implications, consumer perception, how do you feel like those have altered the adoption of sustainable solutions? I know we talked about the education piece, and that's from a consumer perspective, but from a brand perspective, are you seeing increase in adoption or hesitancy in adoption because of their supply chain infrastructure issues, cost?
Yeah. So yes, is the short answer. We have seen that. I would say the consumer perception seems to be the biggest barrier, because once you overcome that and there is a really strong story to tell, it is often how brands grow, right? They need a compelling story about their brand and what they stand for that will resonate with the consumer. On the supply chain and cost side, it really is how you've built the brand. So a great example is like a new product versus an existing product. A new product is often easier for you to build into a sustainable packaging solution because it's new. You can think about your pricing, you can think about your margin, and you can also think about how you want to build that supply chain. But it does bring complexity to always have to innovate on something new rather than on something that already exists. So that's why I've seen the most successes. Like when it's something new, it's much easier to adopt. And then actually, once you know all those variables, you can apply it to everything else. And it doesn't seem so scary, but it is a risk factor. And what we see is actually medium-sized brands are the best to take that, because when you're a very early brand, you're optimizing for so many things. You're just trying to survive, right, in a competitive industry. When you're a large brand, you have so many checks and balances to go through. But when you're a medium brand, you've proven some success. You can do this. You know how to do it. But you're nimble enough to be able to take risk because you want to grow and you want innovation to help you grow. So I think it also depends on the type of brand and what they're optimizing for, that then supply chain and cost becomes more or less of a driver.
You mentioned that it's more difficult for brands to change a product, primary packaging, perhaps for consumer adoption. And are there limitations to the new materials that are emerging for different forms? So I think airless treatment pumps are a great example, right? They have an inner spring. They're difficult to recycle because of the different materials that are put together. However, that is a form that is highly prevalent in a lot of serums, lotions. And so are there different forms that right now is a challenge in terms of the materials that are out there to replicate?
Yeah. And I think the example that you gave is the perfect example, essentially. It is the areas where it is also complex to replicate is when the packaging itself is quite complex, but it ends up serving a very technical purpose for that brand because they are doing it in an airless packaging because they need to protect something quite precious. You ask any brand, like, what do you want to change about your packaging? They will say a pump because it is kind of commonly known knowledge that it is one of the most unsustainable things, and advancements haven't happened as quickly as you would like. But it is also kind of an exciting challenge because we are seeing more and more sustainable companies come onto the market, people who can do something rigid as well as flexible. That's something that we've kind of worked on. And when you can bring quote unquote different materials but have the same beginning and end of life, I think that is actually quite an exciting proposition for the cosmetics industry, and one which we think will really disrupt how we do things, because it enables that desire for aesthetic complexity, high performance, but without having to bring multiple materials together, which causes this issue in the first place.
You mentioned earlier, referred to life cycle analysis, and also, this emergence of brands that are very interested in sustainable packaging. Have you observed an willingness or openness to think about reducing overall environmental impact? So from, cradle to grave ingredient and assessments, do you think that this has helped to facilitate that thought pattern in brands and the industry as a whole?
Yes, that I would say is actually one of what's great is often most people are thinking about it holistically. So they are looking at every aspect of their supply chain and evaluating how they could make an impact. And I think that's how, I guess, it primarily is how the clean beauty movement started, is they started by the ingredients because those were the most important parts, both in terms of what the ingredient was, how it was tested, how it was created. But then I do believe it went into the supply chain. What kind of footprint do those ingredients have? Are they extractive? What are the social aspects of it as well? And I think what we're seeing is that was a revolution started by the beauty industry, but that is why I also feel like it's proliferating now into the package, because it is one of those aspects where that hasn't fully revolutionized. Packaging is still primarily in plastics. And I think that is a pain point for consumers. And so I think that's why packaging seems to be a source of where brands are now thinking if we innovate, we need to also not only innovate on the ingredient, we also need to innovate on the packaging. But I think it's why we found the beauty industry so interesting, because it is kind of leaps and bounds ahead in terms of how they're thinking about what clean means, what sustainability means. At least these discussions are happening. But I do think there's a bit of information asymmetry, or sometimes maybe overload, that prevents brands from actually being able to make a decision. And I think that's where we could do a bit better.
Yeah. And for, I've had friends who make purchasing decisions based on that packaging, right? And if that is a very difficult, I think, area to kind of evaluate in terms,
Yeah.
because there's not, if you need something that you find to be critical, but it only comes in one type of packaging, it becomes a little difficult. In terms of the brands that you interact with, as well as consumer feedback, are you seeing that consumers may be more willing to pay for eco-friendly options, pay either a higher price or seek out sustainable packaging options?
Yes and no. So I do think in some consumers are, and they will put in the effort to go to a specific store to refill their goods, for example. And while that might not be a cost in terms of an actual payment, it is a cost in time. It's a cost in investment. You'll see people resend things back to stores. So there is the very conscious consumer, but there is also the consumer that will look for the best bargain. And I think those have fundamentally always existed. And I don't necessarily think that is changing. Sustainability is more top of mind. So it's more of a variable that they will take into consideration when buying, and more so. So I wouldn't say that it's not necessarily people aren't willing to pay more, but they are willing to choose a different product if it is more sustainable. And at least from what we found, there is quite a wide range in how cosmetics price their products. And so there is an ability to build as a brand, build it into your margin, build it into your pricing structure so that you are competitive, but you're also the one that's picked more, like your growth is better positioned if you are more a sustainable brand. That I do believe.
I know that brands have, you've spoken to a countless number of brands in approaching this challenge, and I'm curious to hear from you what you think is kind of the best way to help brands navigate these challenges. So if I'm a brand and I, come to you and just say, I want more sustainable packaging, kind of what does that conversation then look like?
Yeah, I think it starts with identifying like what are the pain points, what are you solving for, like what is the value that we can provide to you as a brand. Like, are you trying to grow your brand? Is your brand not resonating with your consumers? And then we can talk about like what is the packaging that's going to make the most impact to you, because ultimately I think most people want to do the right thing. They don't want to create a product that is unsustainable and is going to be harmful to the environment. I think we have shifted so much as a collective society that we care so much about that factor. But I think it's just about like what's going to make the most impact. So is it that you actually just need to redo your whole range that we can help you with? Or is it a small intervention for you to test out how your consumers resonate? Like one product, one SKU that will make a high impact. Say it's your best-selling SKU. Maybe that's a better intervention we make. But we have found that it does vary brand to brand. And honestly, there is a rise now of the plastic-free brand. And those brands are doing quite successfully. And not just because I think we're seeing it because there's not only now the pollution aspect of plastics, but the fear around human health and like what is the impact of those chemicals, those microplastics. And that is actually where I'm seeing more of a radical shift around moving away from plastics. And perhaps why sustainability and innovation has started being pushed into a direction, like a new direction.
You shared wish cycling with us, which is a great phrase, and something that I actually found surprising when I learned a number of years ago was how a lot of things that you think are recyclable don't get recycled. And even what you mentioned in terms of any piece that's of a certain dimension will fall through these sorting grates, I think might be news to a lot of people. What do you think is the best way for consumers to start to learn about maybe municipality differences to just general advice for recycling and selection of sustainable packaging?
I think it's a tough one because as a consumer, at least our perspective is that you shouldn't have to seek that out. I think the brands need to be doing that work and our regulators need to be doing that work, right? They need to make it easy on a consumer. They need to, for example, this small products things, those should just generally be regulated out. We know that they can't be recycled. It's and there isn't movement or investment in that infrastructure as well. Like there isn't. There are other higher impact things that we need to fix with recycling first that will help us generally. And I think that needs to become a bit more clear. I think it's hard for consumers to find this information because the information isn't collated. There are kind of good organizations like Plastic Free Planet, where they're kind of trying to provide information across multiple different materials so that brands can at least go and learn. But there are a few ones like that are trying to make that information more widely available.
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor, or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure. You know, things like air and light that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucaps line by going to tagra.com/cellucaps. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
And are there any standards that currently exist for regulatory in terms of sustainable packaging, either globally that you know of?
So not yet globally. I do think a big portion of it is going to be determined from the UN Plastics Pollution Treaty that will then trickle into other decision-making and law globally. I do think that is going to have a huge impact on a number of different regulations. There are other regulations, in Europe at least. There's packaging PPWR. I think it stands for Packaging and Packaging Reduction Act. And things like there's the UK plastics tax. So there are some forms of regulation that are coming in across the globe, but nothing consolidated. And I do think the one that's going to be the most impactful is the UN Plastics Pollution Treaty, because it's going to be negotiated globally and take into consideration many more perspectives that are new and innovative at this point.
Yeah. And I want to go back a little bit to the comment on samples and how, they are inherently just terrible because you can't recycle them. I know sampling is a very big a strategy with brands to get consumers to try them who maybe don't want to purchase at full price. What do you see as part of, clearly if we were to eliminate them, then, what are the options? And so is there an element to changing consumer behavior? So almost psychologically, we need to be doing in order to create more willingness to adopt, not single-use plastic products. It's more of a philosophical question now.
No, I know. It's such a good one, right? But I think it is possible, I'm forever an optimist. Anything is possible. Like, it's one of my greatest, we all learn how to recycle, right? Like, we have a different bin in our house and we do that. And that's coming in with organic recycling as well. So for example, your food waste with a bin, these are introductions we have made into our daily behaviors that didn't exist before and didn't have a need to exist before. So I do think it's possible. And, something like sampling is a great one, because I think everyone involved knows it's probably not the right thing to do, but we don't know what we should do instead. And I think that's where some of this work, by collaborating with the brands and the regulators, now having much more information, can help put that message out to consumers in an easy, digestible way, so that they also have a different toolkit to rely on. Because I think the reason why they aren't able to do it is they don't have another toolkit.
Yeah. And also curious to hear your thoughts on, in this evolving e-commerce where, I am guilty of not leaving my house for a lot of things, including groceries. If I'm selecting a product because I had an alternative. I look at one versus the other on Amazon, let's say, and one had sustainable packaging. But in the end, Amazon is putting it into, a plastic envelope that is only recycling in a select location, as well as, shipping it from, a distance that pretty much negates, how does a consumer navigate that thought process of, it's going from A to B and making good decisions, not just simply based on packaging, instead thinking about holistically, is there a portion that maybe the brands can play in that regard too?
Yeah. And actually, I think the question reminded me of something that brought me a lot of optimism and hope. Was a month ago, my team went to Climate Week in New York, and we presented on the High Line. And the people who got our solution the most was the kids. So I think, while we are discussing the current consumer, I actually think the future consumer knows exactly how to make these decisions, and they are really bought in because they have been brought up. I think everything that they've been taught is like, take care of the environment. And they really feel that. And that is true to their core. And they do get it because at a young age, they're being told about recycling. They're told about like the gaps. I think for us, it's already part of our behavior. And so I think it is harder to change. But for them, they're building the behavior with the right practices. So I think that gives me actually a lot of optimism and hope that the future consumer, they're all in. This is all they know, and they will have the tools to make those decisions.
Awesome. Have you seen any standout brands that have successfully been able to either transition to plastic-free or sustainable packaging? And if so, what lessons do you think can be learned from them?
Yeah, I think, there's one in the UK that's done tremendously well. It's called Wild Cosmetics, and they're most famously known for their refillable deodorant. And I think what's quite interesting with them is they're taking over a lot of shelf space in like Tesco, in Boots, mass environments. So really, I think will spark a question for our incumbents of like, actually, I think they're worried because now they need to compete with these brands. I think what at least I've learned with them is they are quite bold. They do take a risk, and they are willing to iterate and learn extremely rapidly. So this is kind of very general for any brand, but they really leaned in. They were like, we are removing plastics from the bathroom. We're going to do this, and we're just going to go for it. They probably tested like every new material on the market. They did a lot of consumer studies with new and innovative products because it's hard to tell what a consumer would think with something new. So I really think they built their own playbook, and that has served them really well. Yeah.
And when they're doing the consumer testing, I don't think we touched upon it, but, are there, if I was introducing a product onto the market and I was using, let's say, the Vivama material, is it going to look and feel and perform the same way as plastic? I believe your material is, but are there certain aesthetics functionality that maybe other materials that currently exist as replacements to your traditional HDM, the plastic, different plastics out there? Are there certain aesthetics that you can't achieve with these?
Yeah. And I think that has been one of the key constraints with new materials is that you can't always meet the same performances. And I do think that's what's hindered its ability to actually proliferate the market. We always hear, because we're a new material, we'll also hear like the feedback of like what someone's tried before. So for example, someone's tried something before and it hasn't lasted in the warehouse and they've lost that stock. And it causes quite a bit of fear as a brand trying to experiment with something new, or they can't get the specific aesthetic that is in line with the rest of their portfolio, and will a consumer recognize it on the shelf? Again, I think it's kind of interesting, that whole being bold characteristic, where it feels like some brands, they don't ask for permission, they just ask for forgiveness. And they're like, we'll just continue to make it better. And I think if you build a strong community of people who back you. I think one of the best things about a brand is if you build a really strong core community, that will serve you really well when you're trying these kind of really wild things. Didn't mean that pun deliberately, but like when you're kind of experimenting, you need those people to be like, I'm still there. Like, maybe that wasn't the best decision. This, and this about it wasn't working. But at least as a brand, you get that feedback and then you can iterate and evolve. And I think it's the fastest way to kind of get to more success.
Yeah. And you mentioned briefly, but, do you have an example of when a brand has tried to move to sustainable packaging and it didn't go well?
Yeah, I hear a lot of stories from the bigger ones, the enterprise brands that tried to do this and they came across issues, which is why I think they go through such rigorous testing. And it's just not, they see this with traditional materials as well. But when it's something new, it's an added layer of complexity. Sometimes we're like, oh, like, have you ever done this testing with glass when they test our material? And they're like, no, but it's new. So we don't know, like, if this could go wrong. And I'm like, I don't think that this test is relevant, but it's that fear factor. So I think there has been historically a lot of things that have gone wrong, but I do think there is a new wave of materials being built, whether it's the seaweeds of the world, things like Vivama, that we've had the chance to learn from people who were really early in the space, who honestly took all the risk for us because they were developing something for the environment when the market wasn't ready. But I think the market is ready now. So we've managed to get all those learnings in, where a lot more materials will probably pass those specifications that wouldn't have a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And do you see any translation to what's, occurring in cosmetics to potentially foods?
Yeah, I do. I do think food is kind of the place where often people start, right, when they think about sustainable materials and packaging, because it's such, as a consumer, you engage with so much of it every day that you feel quite guilty and you want it gone. For us, we made that deliberate choice of starting in cosmetics because it felt like no one was innovating there, and so people really didn't have a choice. At least in food, you do have some of our more traditional materials like paper, bamboo, or cellulose that you could use. But even in food, there are kind of some new exciting innovations. So there are some, companies like Sway or Notpla with the seaweed base. They're really making great strides in this space. So I think that's one to watch. But yeah, there are all these parallels. I think my view is like cosmetics seems really hard because you have so many formulations and ingredients. So actually, if we crack that, we're good to go.
That's true. In terms of innovation, you touched upon a little bit of, some companies that are emerging, tackling some challenges with food. But, what are some shifts that you foresee in the next 5 to 10 years for the personal care and cosmetic industry?
I think there is going to be a great shift in packaging. We see it with refillables already, right? Like so many brands are pivoting their entire packaging portfolio towards this trend. And I think we're going to see that again in terms of material innovation. I think that's kind of the next leap that people will be making. I also do think there's going to be a lot more cohesiveness that comes across through regulation. I do think this is a space in which people are having those discussions, pushing for more uniformity, pushing more understanding. And I think clean beauty is going to continue to kind of dominate, but add just different dimensions to what clean is. Because I think with sustainability, you can always improve. You could start with ingredients, you can go to the packaging, you could look at the life cycle, you could look at the energy that you're using across your product. There's so many variables. I think it is going to be a continuous cycle. And in a way, we also don't know, I guess maybe slightly philosophical, like at the moment, we know as a human society, like what is going to impact us in terms of climate change, in terms of the environment. But there will be future issues that come up as well. And I think those will help us drive again to another wave of innovation.
Awesome. So to close this out, I've been asking guests what they are curious to learn more about or hear about the industry speak on. And you're going to have to try not to say something related to sustainability, but what have you in attending conferences that maybe aren't directly related to packaging, the industry as a whole, what is something that excites you or you want to learn more about?
I think it's interesting. This one just popped into my head, but it's something that's, it is growing a lot, is how people who are younger and younger engage with skincare and cosmetics. And that is driving a lot of conversation and, I guess, in some aspects concern, some aspects opportunity. I think it's a topic that is underexplored, but is one that is growing in terms of momentum of like what's happening. People are purchasing, people are having access to information on platforms like TikTok, which can sway into certain decision making without a lot of information. I'd love to. That's one personally I would love to dive into.
That is a good one. Yeah. That has kind of snuck up on us quickly. I do contract work, and I did have an individual that said, "Oh, I'm really looking to make a skincare line for my daughter." And I was like, "Okay." And she said, "My daughter's 11," and I don't know if I can do that. So that's a great one, actually. Yeah. Well, this was great. I appreciate your thought leadership in this area, and all the great work that your company is doing, and really excited to see brand adoption.
Amazing. No, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Great. Thank you.